All right. Good morning, everybody. Looks like we have a pretty good amount of people here. It's really nice to see all of you, and I'm excited to be doing the intro to the new mod and the intermission work. So we'll do more introductions at the beginning of week one. I'll talk a little bit more about my background and how I came to Turing and all that good stuff. And I'll let Kelly do the same. And we'll go around and get to know all of you a little bit as well. But just for today, so you have kind of an idea of who I am. My name is Jameson. My pronouns are they, them. I graduated from Turing's backend program with the 1803 cohort, and I worked a couple of startup jobs in Rails and React mostly, and then I came back here to teach. So that's me. And the main thing I'll ask you all to do, or before we get started, I'll say I can pause at any point for questions. If you have them, just use the raise hand reaction so that I can make sure to see that and get to your question. And I'll try to stop here and there to take questions as well. But with that, I'm going to drop this link in the Zoom chat. I can find it. And this is the backend page with the intermission work. Excuse me. So I'm also going to share my screen as we go through this. Can everybody see that okay? Cool, thank you. All right, so here's our intermission work for mod 2. We're basically moving away from how you all have built apps in Ruby that you can work with on your local machine to building full-fledged web pages that other people can interact with over the internet. So the first part of that, as far as our learning goals is concerned, is the visual elements of the web page that users will interact with. This involves a basic understanding of HTML and CSS. And some of the learning goals for the intermission work are to start becoming comfortable with these syntaxes and create a static web page using HTML and CSS. And we'll get into more detail about what that looks like in a moment. In addition to creating those visual elements and styling that users can see and interact with on your web page, another big part of mod 2 will be databases. So if you think about your favorite website or application, data is what drives it. Facebook wouldn't be much if people couldn't, create posts or save their username or update things about their profile, right? And all of that is data that is stored somewhere. So data is really what makes our websites interesting. And we'll spend a lot of time talking about SQL or SQL, understanding how relational databases work, and then also, creating our own databases and modifying them and all that good stuff, doing data logic. So this will be the second piece of the intermission work. The other pieces, these are technically two separate things. There's the basics of web development. So understanding and implementing CRUD functionality will be something you'll start to do in the intermission work. This CRUD, we'll see this a lot during mod 2, but it stands for create, read, update, and destroy. And these are actions that users will be able to take on data in our applications. And then we'll also be covering and talking about a lot in mod 2, this concept of an MVC design pattern, which stands for Model View Controller. And this will be another key part of the intermission work as well. And then we'll begin learning the conventions of a Rails app. So the very last thing in this list that we'll go through is building a Rails app from scratch, just the very basics of how Rails works and how Ruby on Rails expects things to be set up. And Ruby on Rails is a framework that operates heavily on conventions. So we're starting you off with an exercise that will help you to learn those conventions and kind of the rules of how things are organized. So MVC and CRUD are things that we will accomplish using the Ruby on Rails framework, which is kind of like the piece that will tie together this front-facing visual problem, right? Like we have the user looking at the HTML elements and how we've styled it with the CSS. And then on the back end, what we as backend developers are super interested in is working with data and working with those things that actually drive the application. And Ruby on Rails is a framework that helps us tie those things together using the Ruby language. It manages a lot of the kind of under the hood or magical stuff that connects our HTML to our database. Cool. So as far as deliverables, we're going to ask you to create a gist or a GIST. Have you all worked with these before? Have you made a GIST before? Yeah, seems like it. Good. And that cool. That seems like it'll be familiar. We have a template here that you can use. And basically, we have all of these checks for understanding listed out here in this markdown. These checks for understanding will also show up in each of the assignments so that you can kind of have them at the top of mind as you're working through each individual exercise. But essentially, what we're going to ask you to do is make a copy of this. And what you can do is go to the raw button on the GIST and just copy everything here. This is the raw markdown. So I'm going to actually walk through this, I think. So I can just copy and paste this. And if I go over and I make a new GIST, this should format everything for me. And as long as you do .md at the end of the file, it will kind of create that for you. And it'll all be formatted. And then all you should have to do is just go in here and, add your answers, whatever. So that will be the main piece of what you submit. I will point out that at the end of this page, there's a submission section, which has a Google form. And we'll ask you to link the GIST, and then we'll go over the static challenge repo in a second, and then share your name and pronouns. And that will be how you submit the intermission work. This is due by 5 p.m. Mountain Time, the Saturday before the module begins. So of course, we have a 2-week intermission. We have a little bit of extra time to get through this material, but we really do want to see you all turning this in by 5 p.m. the Saturday before the mod starts. If you have an extenuating circumstance or something that comes up and we need to figure out an alternative schedule, by all means, DM myself and Kelly Murray, as your instructors. We want to work with you and be fair and make accommodations if you definitely need them. But otherwise, barring any extenuating circumstances, we really do want to see these turned in by then. What we found is that if students have trouble getting their environment set up, or an issue with their computer, or they can't get to the intermission work for any reason, they tend to struggle to catch up in Mod 2, and we really want everybody to hit the ground running. And that doesn't mean that you need to understand or completely comprehend everything in the intermission material, but it does mean that you will be off to a much better start if you get through the entirety of it. Before we go into what the assignments are in more detail, does anybody have questions up until this point? Cool. Well, like I said, I may glance at the chat every now and then, but definitely use the raise hand reaction if anything is coming up for you. Cool. So as far as the assignments are concerned, we'd like you to do these in the order that they're listed here. Each one will assume you've completed the previous one. And we will, the very first thing is to get you set up with the Ruby version 2.7.2 if you're not already, and then we will also get you set up with Rails 5.2.5. And here is an installation guide that we'd like you all to work through first. It should be fairly straightforward. That being said, I remember that last inning, there were a few people who had the computers with the M1 chips, and that was still pretty new. And so some people went through this with no problem. And then for other people, there were a few just like issues getting installed and set up. So definitely reach out if you're having any trouble with the installation or with versioning. It may be that we need to have some sort of install party where I could get on Zoom and kind of try to work through these issues with you all. But the instructions here are pretty good and up to date. So hopefully that's smooth sailing, and that's the very first thing that you'll need to do. Let me kind of go through this in more detail. We'll use Ruby 2.7.2, and we'll do that with rbend, and then you can set it locally to 7.2 with whatever directory you're working in. Occasionally throughout the mod, we might have exercises or resources that we provide to you that are in a different Ruby version. So I would recommend getting as comfortable as you can with rbend so that as you move around directories, you feel good changing your local Ruby version and then changing it back to 2.7.2 for things like class and assessments and stuff like that. Always double check your Ruby version is correct after changing it with ruby-v. So this is the command you would run to make sure you're on Ruby 2.7.2. As far as Rails, Rails is what we call a gem, and a gem is a package that is installed in our Rails environment. So if you're using rbend, they're specific to your current Ruby version, and you'll need to make sure that you're on 2.7.2. before proceeding. But then you should be able to do this to see if you have Rails. If you don't, then you can install this specific version of Rails. Make sure that you do pass it this 525. Otherwise, with the version flag, sorry. If you don't pass it this, it will likely install the most recent version of Rails, and then we'll have to ask you to downgrade. So yeah, make sure you're installing 525. And then you can check your Rails version with a similar command, Rails-V. And if you do run into any issues and get a different version of Rails besides 525, there are some instructions here for resetting that, uninstalling Rail ties, and then installing the correct version. Of course, this says 523, so just make sure that you're referring to this page for the version you should have. Cool. So that's the initial setup. The next section is getting the module to tools. And again, I do expect most of this to be very straightforward. You're going to be downloading PostgreSQL from the Postgres homepage and just dragging that into your applications folder like you're downloading any kind of program. And it has some instructions here for getting it going with initializing it and all that stuff. And then another link for installing command line interface tools for Postgres specifically. The documentation that we linked here should get you going pretty easily. And then there's another tool that we'll use in conjunction with Postgres called Postico, and it should have instructions here at this link as well. The last thing I'll mention here is we really want to make sure everybody is using Google Chrome. If you've been using Safari or Firefox or anything like that up to this point, we also want you to have Chrome available because it has some really cool shortcuts that are useful, or not shortcuts, but tools that are useful to us as developers. So primarily like these dev tools where we can go in and inspect things about our HTML, about our HTTP and the requests that we're sending to the internet. So we won't get into that in great detail right now, but it is important that you have Chrome installed and ready on day one. Then we have 3 more sections here that I would like to talk about. The main thing here is styling for point 3. This is, like I said, all the visual things that users will interact with when they come to your web application or your web page. So the first one here is the intro to HTML. And this, like you see here, like I mentioned earlier, the checks for understanding that will be in your deliverable are here just to kind of like refresh your memory and keep you focused on the things that we really want you to take away from the intermission work. So as you're reading through this material and working through the exercises, you can reference these checks for understanding to know what's like really the most important information. And then we recommend the W3 Schools HTML tutorial, and there is a tool called Try It Yourself with most of these, which I will demonstrate here in a second, and that'll allow you to actually explore the HTML, get a little bit of hands-on experience, and it will directly refer to the questions that we'll be asking you to answer. So what that might look like is you'll go here to the HTML tutorial, and it will tell you about some stuff, and then there will be a try it yourself button, so you can click on that. And this is all here in the browser. You don't really have to manage any files or anything like that. You can just play around with what's here on the left side panel and then click run, and it will update over here. So maybe I want to say, this is a mod to intro heading, and this is a paragraph. I type a bunch of stuff here. And then maybe I want to try out an H3 tag and say blah, blah, blah. And this is a neat tool because then you can just kind of get an idea of what that would look like and practice a little bit of HTML. So we'd like you to work through all of the articles or tutorials listed here. There's 18 of them. Some of them will be more commonly used than others, but I think this is a really good place to start just wrapping your head around HTML, especially if it's something you've never worked with. But even if you are familiar with HTML, this is a really good review. And definitely want to have some level of comfort with the syntax going into Mod 2. Similarly, we have the intro to CSS. This is also a W3 Schools tutorial, and it also has the try it yourself section. So this CSS has to do with styling and how your HTML is actually changes in appearance and how it looks. CSS stands for cascading style sheets. Don't necessarily need to remember that exactly, but FYI. So here is the sandbox environment. If I wanted to change the background color here, I could say like purple and then run it. And that would, yeah, so this is, yeah, just a very similar way to experiment with CSS and practice the concepts that are introduced in this tutorial. Cool. And oops, sorry for the switching back and forth, trying not to do that. The ones that you must complete are everything underneath this section from introduction to CSS fonts. So those two sections are linked here. And if you find yourself with extra time and you enjoy this stuff, you can absolutely feel free to look at more. W3 Schools in general is a pretty good resource. But I think the real heavy lifting of this HTML and CSS practice comes with the static challenge. So this is the idea of the static challenge is you'll basically be creating a static web page. So not a web page that's deployed to the internet or has any changing information, but just a web page with HTML and CSS. And we are not super focused on this in Mod 2. We'll have a couple of opportunities for you all to do independent explorations and look at lessons and stuff like that to get more information on HTML and CSS. But our focus is, of course, on data as backend developers. So we'd like you to time box the static challenge for no more than 2 hours. You can always add more to make it look prettier and better. That can be like a time suck really fast. So definitely time box it and just get as far as you can. And I will kind of walk through the process of working on this static challenge real quick here. So the main thing to know is that the index.html file is where you'll be putting your HTML. The reset.css file you should not need to touch. This includes styles that just override default styles provided by the browser. Main.css is where you actually want to be writing your CSS and defining your styles. So the expectation is for you to choose one of these images in the completed directory. So I'll open one of these. And I wish I could, it has to scroll. I wish I could zoom out. I don't think that would, yeah, no. But essentially these will be in the repo when you clone it down, and these are static web pages. And the idea is that we want you to create the HTML to divide up each of these elements, do the styling that would pull in the images and change the font size and change the background color and all that stuff. You don't need to go hunt down the images or the text that is in these examples. They're provided in sitecopy.md in this repo, and then there's an images directory that provides the images used in each of the comps. So what you'll be doing is cloning this repository. You're going to fork the repository, I'm sorry, and then clone it. But just to give you an idea, I'm just going to clone this one. I won't be pushing up any changes. So get clone and then paste this and then cd into static challenges. And then I'll open that up in Atom. Do I have Atom open? Okay. Sorry, everybody. Let me get this all set up. Here we are in Atom. I have my HTML here, and then there's the main.css here, which I will pull over to this side, maybe, possibly. There we go. So here it just sets you up with like the very basics. I think you're going to be, yeah, it sets you up with the very basics. You don't really need to pay too much attention to what is between the head tags, but we'll be working inside of the body. And if I look at this example, actually, maybe I can get it here. That's the images I want completed. There we go. So here's the example, and I see the very first thing I need is like a header up here, right? Saying that says 5280 landmarks. It should be white and it should have a red background. So I'm going to add in an H1 tag and say 5280 landmarks, and close out my H1 tag. And then I can save this. And a really handy command for this kind of thing is you can just run open and then the file that you'd like to open in your browser. So in our case, that's index.html. In the terminal, I'm going to type open index.html, and that'll pull it up in my browser. And you see that the text that I added is here. But what if I want that to be a little bit bigger or have a different background color? That's where I can come into my HTML and add an ID, and see, I'll just call it main header. And then here in the CSS, I can target that HTML element by the ID, and I can say main header, open up these braces and say background color red, and then maybe I want the color of the text to be white, and then ooh, I need to work on my CSS. I think it would be font size 20 rem, something like that, right? And then I can check my work, open it up again. Oh, that's way too big. But you get the idea. That's kind of the process of going through the static challenge. And the resources listed in the HTML and CSS tutorial should be plenty to get you started on that. And it does not need to be perfect. I really want to emphasize that this should be time boxed to no more than 2 hours. Just getting a little bit of practice will go a long way. Cool. Any questions about any of that before I move on to the SQL section of this work? Matt, sorry, I was muted.
I'm just curious if we're going to be using Mod 2 to build programs that have HTML and CSS integrated in them.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, you will.
Cool.
And I think when you get to 0.5 and actually get into Rails a little bit more, you might see how that fits into the broader picture a little bit more clearly. And when we actually start the mod, we'll be expanding on the kinds of tools that we use for CSS and HTML and Rails. But this section here is mostly to give you like a primer to get you ready for building out views and templates in a Rails app.
Well, thanks for that.
Of course. Any other questions coming up for y'all? Cool. Okay. Yep. Before I move on to SQL, what I'll say about most of that is that I wouldn't say that we're really doing front end development, but we are working with HTML and CSS to make, presentable and readable views. And it's really not the focus of Mod 2, but it's definitely something that we will be using and needing to have a basic understanding of. All right, so let's move on to SQL. This is a really interesting piece, I think. This is where we get into kind of the fun stuff of backend development, in my opinion, interacting with a database. So we'll talk a lot about a tool in Rails that we have available to us called Active Record. An Active Record is essentially a gem that helps us work with SQL in a better and in a way with less overhead, essentially. It makes it easier to work with SQL, but SQL is what connects us to our database and allows us to interact with and manipulate data. So this is a tutorial. You're going to stop at the SQL section linked at the bottom, and you do not need to complete that. So this is a lot on the basic syntax of SQL, how it works, the rules, basic operations that you'll need to understand. And like I said, you will stop here. When you get to Active Record, this is as far as you should go. So that's that. Again, we have our checks for understanding here. And then where you actually get to apply this is at pgexercises.com. This is using PostgreSQL. We'll talk about this more when we actually get into the material in Mod 2, but there can be a couple of different programs or languages or frameworks really that you use with SQL. And in the tutorial, that's SQLite 3, but in Mod 2, we will be using PostgreSQL. So this is a really great resource to start practicing with. And I think I will just click on these links here. So this will it says work through the following sections of the exercises on the site. You don't need to really walk away from this with a mastery of SQL or feel like you understand everything. I would say definitely time box these as well. And maybe like 2 hours for each of these sections would be plenty. So probably want to spend more than an hour on each section, but no more than 2. We have basics, which is just going to kind of get you started with SQL. Then we have joins, which is going to talk about working with multiple tables of data. So like different types of objects, and then aggregates for doing like logic with the data that you're retrieving and manipulating. So to give you an example of what that exercise might look like, I'm going to go to this where exercise, and it has a like a little box here where you can type out your answer, and then you can run the query and it'll tell you if you were correct or not. And then there's a section down here where you can reveal the answers if you really, really get stuck. But before you do that, there is a hint functionality in this website. So if you are here and you're saying like, select name from whatever, and you run it and you get a little X and you're really stuck, you can start with a hint and it will point you in the right direction. The where clause allows you to filter the rows you want to retrieve. And this might be enough to kind of get you to the documentation of the tutorial and refresh your memory and get the query running. But if you do really get stuck, I would say come down here and look at the answers and then go back and try to implement it again. Like I mentioned, you really don't have to understand everything that's going on or feel super comfortable with SQL, but do your best to just read over the answers and understand what's going on and start to wrap your head around why it works the way it works. So we have all of these here. That is basically it for SQL. And then you have your checks for understanding. Yeah, I don't really have a whole lot of other stuff to say about that. Get rid of these. And then the last thing we have here is the Rails tutorial. It's called Task Manager. This was created by instructors, and all the instructions here should really be very thorough and help you get through the whole thing. It's a lot of material, though. It's probably the longest thing in all of the intermission work. So if I scroll, you can kind of see this goes on and on and on. It walks you through setting up an entire Rails app. So I mentioned CRUD earlier. This is pretty central to everything that we'll be doing in Mod 2. Create, read, update, and delete. And we'll make heavy use of these 4 actions throughout Mod 2. So this is going to walk you through using Rails to build an application where you can manage some tasks or chores. You can see how we're going to be following the MVC design pattern, doing CRUD actions, and a few of the conventions and best practices. We do recommend that you do not copy and paste the code in this tutorial. There's so much typing and so many files and just new information in Mod 2 that is very different from what you were learning in Mod 1. So it's in your best interest to really go through and type these things out. Also, I think one of the most challenging things about, in my opinion, about moving from working in plain Ruby to working in a framework like Rails is that those little syntax errors or typos can really trip you up for a long time. And the sooner you get practice reading your error messages and debugging them, the better. Really slow down and read your error messages if you get them during this entire process. And that will really help you throughout the mod. So I won't go through very much of this, but just at a high level, there's a section on getting configured, creating your actual new Rails app, giving it some flags for the configuration that we recommend. There will be a huge folder structure that you all will start to learn to navigate. I do recommend getting familiar with the hotkeys or the shortcuts in your text editor. Things like doing a search of all files or opening a file with like a fuzzy search. I think in Atom it's Command P, where you can open up a little search bar. Actually, I have it open here. Why don't I do that? If I wanted to open up main.css from here, I could do Command P and start typing main.css. And that can be a lot easier using that shortcut than trying to scroll through an entire Rails file tree. I find that this is sometimes the most overwhelming part about beginning to work in Rails for students. So this walks a little bit more through that, talks about how gems work and installing these dependencies and packages for your code. Yeah, so this is a lot of material. I would set aside a fair amount of time during the intermission to work through this, but it's also super beneficial. And if you get through it and it feels very fuzzy, that's okay, that's expected. But you are more than welcome to walk through it a second time if you have the bandwidth for that. This is very, very valuable. And in the early days and weeks of Mod 2, we will reference Task Manager a lot for examples in class and stuff like that. And that's everything I have for the assignments. Again, the form to put all these links in, or put the link to your GIST and any other information in, is at the bottom of this page. What questions do you all have? Antonio?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. I'm looking at the calendar and it looks like we do start class on Monday. I know from my kids' schedules and their daycare schedules and stuff, Monday is like a recognized or when 4th of July is actually observed, but we do have class on Monday.
Yeah, that we are starting class on Monday the 5th. I think in almost every case, we would recognize that as a holiday, but there were some like accreditation things and paperwork on the touring admin side that required us to start on the 5th. So yeah, expect to be in class the day after Independence Day.
Okay, and then the other question is the time commitment for this pre-work. Would you say is it comparable to the pre-work for mod 1, like 30 to 40 hours, or do you think it would take longer?
I'd say typically I recommend between 20 and 30 hours for this intermission work. You could definitely spend more, but I think especially with it being a double intermission, if you could spend 30 hours the second week and take a break the first week and really rest, it's probably going to depend person to person, but I wouldn't expect this material to take more than like one pass through everything. I wouldn't expect that to take more than 30 hours. And maybe to get into that a little bit more, what I might do if I was a student and I was doing this intermission work is try to get this setup done maybe by Monday, either over the weekend or after retro or something like that. Just kind of get the configuration stuff out of the way and reach out to us if you have any issues with that. And then like take some time over the weekend, hopefully maybe work on styling. Each of these probably takes, I would say this entire styling section would maybe take most of a workday. So maybe spend Monday doing the styling, the intro to HTML, CSS, and then 2 hours on the static challenge. Maybe take a break on Tuesday, do something for myself, come back on Wednesday and try to get through all of the SQL stuff. Probably a full workday there between the tutorial and the exercises. And then take a break on Thursday and complete the Rails tutorial on Friday and Saturday. Like if this were an ordinary 1 week intermission, that might be the strategy that I used. If you prefer half days, you could probably get all of this done with 5 half days, or maybe like a little bit more, maybe 6 half days. It really depends upon how you work best. But if you're spending more than 45 hours over the 2 weeks, I think that's probably a little bit much. But it definitely should take more than 20 hours to get through everything and get through it well. Is that helpful?
Yep, thank you.
No problem. What else? And one thing that might be kind of obvious, but I don't think I mentioned explicitly, is that all of these times that we are going to be sharing will be Mountain Time unless otherwise stated. I know that some people in Slack have used an extension or an app called Time Zone Butler that will take messages that we send and like suggest a time for you in your time zone. Yeah, but just to make it super clear, whenever we give a time, we will be listing these times in Mountain Time. Do we have anybody who's not in Mountain Time in this cohort? Okay, cool. A few people. Nice. And we will get to know you all better and where you're from and all that good stuff day 1 of the mod. Cool. Taylor.
Are there any other Slack channels to join for Mod 2, or is the 2105 backend still our primary channel and all the main information will just be reflected there?
That's exactly right. The 2105 backend channel is where you want to be, and then you have the 2105 code help channel for posting questions and stuff like that.
Got it. Thanks.
Sure. Marla?
In terms of like getting in contact with instructors during break, I'm guessing Slack is still kind of the preferred method in the code help channel. Is there anything else that we need to be aware of during that time, I guess?
Question. Let me pull up my calendar. I don't know, is Kelly here? I don't know if Kelly made it here today. Oh,
I'm here.
Yes, they are. Kelly, would you like to quickly introduce yourself and maybe share a little bit about your availability over the break?
Yes. So I'm Kelly. I'm a new instructor here at Turing, but I've been teaching tech since 2014. My video is off today because I actually have been in the hospital the last 2 days and I didn't want to scare you all with the dark bags under my eyes, but you will see my face, I promise. My availability, I am pretty much available all break. I mean, I may not respond right away to you, but I'll be checking Slack every day and hopefully we'll be able to get back to you pretty soon.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you for being here. I'm so sorry that you have not been well, but I hope that you are on a
feeling
track
much
to a
better.
speedy recovery. Good.
I'm feeling much better. Thank you.
No problem. Cool. So yeah, thank you, Kelly. And then as for my availability, I will talk a little bit about that. Slack is still a really good way to get a hold of me. I might not be as responsive over the intermission as I would be during a cohort, but essentially I will be leaving out of town on Friday afternoon of next week and might not be super available until around Monday or Tuesday. So if you do message me or tag me in anything between this upcoming Friday, the 25th and like the 28th, just be aware that I won't be as connected to the internet and stuff like that. But after the 29th, I will have one more day of travel sometime here. Unfortunately, I don't know which day I'll be traveling back to Colorado, but yes, through most of this second week, I will be available to answer questions asynchronously. And I think if we need to have any kind of install party for like getting online and making sure everybody is set, like on a Zoom call, making sure everybody is set up with the right Ruby version and all those things, I would like to get that done before the 24th, so before Thursday of next week. So these first few days as well, I should be pretty available and you can get a hold of me through Slack. Sorry, I don't know if I was rambling about that, but let's go. Marla, does that answer your question or any follow-up?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, no problem. Antonio.
Yeah, and to tag on to Marla, so is it just you and Kelly that we would reach out to? I noticed there's a Brian that's listed as one of the instructors.
Yeah, I do need to update that to that backend page to reflect that it'll be me and Kelly as the instructors for Mod 2 for y'all. I believe, I should probably confirm this because I haven't confirmed this, but I think Madeline is still available as student support. So that would be a resource to reach out to for debugging and things like that. I know that she has her own availability and scheduling system and stuff like that, but that's another great resource. But yeah, we'll be the two instructors.
Great, thanks.
Sure. Okay, that is everything I have. If there aren't any more questions from you all, I will go ahead and let you go now. So final call for any burning questions, comments, or concerns that you have. Okay, I'm really excited to get started in 2107 with you all. We'll do more introductions and cover more about what to expect for the actual mod on day one. But until then, if you run into anything with your environment, especially, but any questions that come up at all, just shoot both of us a DM if you could, Kelly and myself. And yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you on Monday of week 1.
Really excited.
Me too. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.